The courtroom was filled with people that morning. Lawyers flipped through papers, clients whispered to each other nervously, and family members sat quietly, waiting for their names to be called. The air carried the weight of seriousness that always came with legal matters. In the middle of this busy room, Judge Harrison entered, walking with calm authority. He was a tall man in his late 50s, respected by everyone for being strict but fair. When he put on his glasses and looked over the files in front of him, the room always fell silent. People knew he was not someone who tolerated foolishness. Among the people waiting was a young girl named Amara. She was only 6 years old, dressed in a neat little yellow dress. She sat beside her mother, who looked tired and anxious. Amara's mother was there for a custody hearing, and she kept whispering to her daughter to stay calm and quiet. The girl tried her best to sit still, but her curious eyes moved around the courtroom, studying everyone. She had never been in a place like this before, and everything seemed big, serious, and a little scary. As Judge Harrison began the session, he spoke with his usual deep and steady voice. Everyone listened carefully, but Amara tilted her head as if something about him caught her attention. She kept staring at the judge, her little eyes narrowing as if she was trying to solve a puzzle in her mind. She looked at his face, the way he moved his hands, the serious way he spoke. Something inside her told her that she had seen him before, even though she could not explain where. Suddenly, in the middle of the silence, Amara stood up. Her small shoes made a tapping sound against the wooden floor as she pointed her little finger straight at the judge. Her voice, innocent yet confident, filled the room as she said, "You're my dad." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. The clerk froze with his pen in midair. A lawyer who had been whispering to his client gasped out loud. The bailiff turned his head quickly, his eyes wide in shock. People sitting in the benches whispered to each other, not sure if they heard correctly. Even the mother's face turned pale, and she quickly tried to pull Amara back down into her seat. Judge Harrison's hand trembled slightly as he adjusted his glasses. He was a man known for keeping complete control of his emotions, but now, for the first time in many years, his face changed color. He looked at the child, stunned, while the echo of her words repeated in his mind. His chest felt heavy. The courtroom, normally filled with voices and movement, was completely silent. All eyes were on him, waiting for his reaction. The mother whispered urgently, "Amara, sit down, please." She tried to hush her daughter, embarrassed and nervous. But Amara, being young and innocent, spoke again with even more certainty. "You are my dad. I know it. I can see it." Gasps spread across the courtroom. Some people covered their mouths in disbelief. Others leaned forward, whispering to each other about what this could mean. The lawyers shifted uncomfortably, sensing that something far beyond a legal case was happening. The defense attorney, always sharp, immediately noticed the possible impact of the revelation. He leaned toward his client, already thinking about how this unexpected moment could be used in the case. Judge Harrison cleared his throat, but his voice was not as steady as usual. He tried to continue with the case, but the little girl's words kept echoing in his head. His heart beat faster than it had in years. For a moment, he saw flashes of his past memories he thought he had locked away. He remembered a woman he once cared for deeply, many years ago, before his career had consumed his life. He remembered the way she had suddenly left without saying goodbye, leaving him confused and hurt. Could this child be connected to that time? Could her words actually hold the truth? The silence in the courtroom was heavy, but also filled with curiosity and suspense. Everyone waited for the judge to respond, but Harrison struggled to find words. He glanced at the girl's mother, who looked away quickly, her hands shaking slightly. She seemed to know something but was unwilling to say it in front of so many people. Finally, Judge Harrison took a deep breath. "This court will take a short recess," he announced, his voice trembling just enough for the lawyers and staff to notice. He stood up and left the bench, his robe swaying behind him. The bailiff called out, "All rise," but no one really moved. People were too busy whispering about what just happened. Amara's mother leaned down, whispering sharply, "Why would you say that?" But Amara's answer was simple. "Because it's true. I just know it." Her innocent eyes remained calm, even as her mother looked around nervously at all the stares from the people in the room. Behind closed doors, Judge Harrison sat in his private chambers. His usually neat and organized desk looked blurry before his eyes. He removed his glasses and rubbed his forehead, trying to calm his thoughts. For so many years, he had lived a life of discipline, focusing only on his career, building a reputation as a man of fairness and law. But now, one small child's voice had shaken everything. In that moment, he realized that his past had never truly left him. He thought about the woman he once loved and lost. Could she be the mother of this child? Could he really be the father? His hands trembled as he tried to imagine what this meant for his life. Meanwhile, out in the courtroom, the atmosphere buzzed with energy. Some people whispered that the girl was only making things up. Others insisted that children often speak the truth without fear. The defense attorney leaned back in his chair, smiling faintly, already thinking about how this surprising twist might change the outcome of the case. But for Amara, it was simple. She did not care about court cases, laws, or arguments. She only knew what her heart told her. And her heart told her that the man sitting high on that bench, the one with the serious face and kind eyes, was her father. That single moment, filled with silence, whispers, and heavy hearts, marked the beginning of a story that would change all of their lives forever. The courtroom was still buzzing with whispers even after the judge had left for recess. Lawyers leaned close to their clients, discussing what had just happened. Some thought it was a mistake or a child's imagination, while others believed it might be the truth. Amara sat quietly now, her little legs swinging from the bench. She didn't seem embarrassed at all. In fact, she looked calmer than everyone else. Her mother, on the other hand, was nervous. She kept holding Amara's hand tightly, as if worried her daughter might speak again and make things worse. Minutes passed slowly until a court officer returned and announced that the session would resume shortly. Everyone looked toward the front, waiting for Judge Harrison. When he walked back into the courtroom, his face looked steady, but his eyes told a different story. Those who had known him for years could sense something was different. The strong, unshaken man they respected now carried a heavy weight. He sat down at the bench, tapped his gavel gently, and tried to regain control of the room. "We will continue with today's hearing," he said in a deep voice, though it wasn't as firm as before. But just as he began reading the next file, Amara stood again. This time her voice was softer but clear. "You're my dad," she said once more. The mother quickly pulled her daughter down and whispered sharply, "Please stop it." But it was too late. The entire room had heard again. Some people covered their mouths in shock, while others leaned forward, eager to see what would happen next. The defense attorney, Mr. Briggs, who had a reputation for being quick and clever, immediately stood up. With a slight smile, he said, "Your Honor, perhaps this statement should not be ignored. If the child's words are true, it may have a direct effect on this case." The courtroom broke into more whispers. The prosecutor objected, saying this was irrelevant and disrespectful to the court. But everyone knew the truth. The little girl's voice had already shifted the entire atmosphere. Judge Harrison looked at Mr. Briggs and then at the child, who was now staring at him with steady, innocent eyes. He wanted to say something, but the words stuck in his throat. Finally, he spoke slowly. "This court will not discuss personal matters unrelated to the current case." He tried to sound professional, but his voice shook slightly. People noticed. The mother lowered her head, ashamed, while Amara simply blinked, as if surprised that no one was listening to her truth. Judge Harrison paused for a long moment, then suddenly announced, "The court will take an extended recess. This matter requires consideration." The gavel struck again, and he stood up quickly, leaving the courtroom before anyone could question him further. In his chambers, Harrison closed the door and leaned against it. His heart was pounding. He had faced many difficult cases in his career: murders, scandals, disputes worth millions, but never had he faced something this personal. The image of the little girl pointing at him replayed in his mind again and again. She looked so sure, so certain, and something about her face struck him deeply. Her eyes, they reminded him of someone. He sat down and pulled out an old file cabinet key from his desk. He rarely opened that cabinet, but now he unlocked it and pulled out a folder that had been untouched for years. Inside were old photographs and letters from a woman named Grace. She was someone he had once loved dearly in his younger days. They had shared dreams, laughter, and a deep bond, but then she disappeared from his life. He had never known why. Looking at those pictures now, his heart ached. He remembered how her eyes had looked when she smiled, eyes that looked exactly like the little girl's in his courtroom. His hand shook as he set the photo down. Could it really be possible? Could that child be his daughter? If so, why had Grace never told him? Why had she vanished without explanation? Questions swirled in his mind, but there was only one way to find answers. Meanwhile, in the waiting area, Amara's mother sat stiffly, trying to ignore the curious stares of strangers. People whispered, pointing at her and her child. Some showed sympathy, others suspicion. She wished the ground would open and swallow her whole. Amara, however, looked calm. She leaned against her mother and whispered, "Why is everyone acting like it's a big secret? I know he's my dad." Her mother squeezed her hand but didn't answer. A court officer soon approached the mother and asked her to follow to the judge's chambers. Nervous, she stood up, holding Amara close. Inside the chambers, Judge Harrison sat at his desk, looking at them with a mix of authority and something softer uncertainty. He gestured for the girl to wait outside with the officer, then asked to speak privately with the mother. The door closed, and silence filled the room. Finally, he spoke. "Tell me the truth," he said quietly. "Is she my daughter?" The mother's eyes filled with tears. For years, she had carried the secret, thinking she was protecting both her child and him. She explained how she had discovered she was pregnant after their brief but meaningful relationship. At the time, Harrison was just beginning his career, filled with ambition. She knew he wanted to become a great lawyer and one day a judge. She feared that telling him about the child would ruin his future or that he might reject them both. So she left, choosing to raise Amara alone. Judge Harrison sat in silence as the truth sank in. His heart was heavy with regret. All these years, he had lived in discipline and success, but he had missed the chance to know his daughter. He looked down at his hands, realizing how much time had been lost. When Amara was brought back into the room, she ran to her mother's side. Harrison looked at her differently now, not just as a child who disrupted his courtroom, but as a part of himself. She tilted her head and asked innocently, "Are you mad at me?" His throat tightened. He shook his head slowly and whispered, "No, never." The moment was quiet but powerful. He wanted to embrace her, but years of formality and distance held him back. Still, in his heart, something had changed forever. Back in the courtroom, people could sense that something had happened during the recess. Whispers continued, but no one truly knew what the private conversation revealed. Judge Harrison announced he would step away from handling the case, transferring it to another judge. But behind his calm words, his mind was racing. His life had shifted in ways he could never have imagined when the day began. And Amara, with her simple truth, had opened a door to a past he thought was gone forever. The news of what had happened inside the courtroom spread like wildfire. By the time Judge Harrison stepped out of his chambers later that day, many people in the courthouse already knew that a little girl had stood up and called him her father. Some believed it was nonsense, a child's imagination, but others whispered that the girl's eyes and her confidence could not be ignored. The courthouse, which was usually filled with serious legal talk, now buzzed with gossip. Amara's mother held her daughter's hand tightly as they walked through the hallway, trying to avoid the curious stares. Some people smiled at the little girl as if they admired her courage, while others shook their heads, believing she had embarrassed her mother. But Amara didn't seem bothered. She was humming softly, swinging her little arm, as if she had just told the simplest truth in the world. Judge Harrison, however, was not at peace. He returned to his office after the case was reassigned to another judge. His desk, once a place of neat files and organized pens, now felt heavy with questions. He kept staring at the old photograph of Grace, the woman he once loved, and comparing it with the memory of the little girl's face. The resemblance was undeniable. Her eyes, her smile, even the tilt of her head, it all echoed Grace. He leaned back in his chair, feeling both joy and regret. Joy, because the possibility of having a daughter filled his heart in a way he had never felt before. Regret, because so many years had been lost in silence. That afternoon, he requested a private meeting with Amara's mother. She agreed, though she was nervous, and they met in a small conference room away from the public eye. Harrison looked at her, his voice softer than ever before. "Why didn't you tell me?" he asked. Her eyes lowered. She explained again how she feared that his ambitions, his career, and his family's expectations would never allow space for her or the child. She didn't want to become a burden in his life. She thought disappearing was the best choice. Tears welled up in her eyes as she added, "I didn't know we'd end up in your courtroom. I never wanted her to find out this way." Harrison listened, his jaw tightening as he absorbed every word. He realized she had lived in silence and sacrifice, raising their child alone. His heart ached, not with anger, but with sadness for the years that had been stolen from him. He looked at her and said quietly, "You didn't give me a choice." Meanwhile, Amara sat just outside with a kind court officer who offered her a cookie from the vending machine. She happily nibbled on it, swinging her legs and asking innocent questions like, "Why does everyone look so serious here?" The officer chuckled, amazed at how calm she was despite the tension swirling around her. Back inside, the conversation between the judge and the mother grew deeper. Harrison asked about Amara's life, what she liked, what her dreams were, whether she was happy. The mother, though hesitant at first, eventually opened up. She told him about how Amara loved to draw, how she was curious about everything, and how she often asked questions about her father. Every detail cut Harrison deeper. He realized he had missed her first steps, her first words, her birthdays, and all the small moments that shape a child's life. By the end of the conversation, his decision was clear. "I want to know her," he said firmly. The mother nodded slowly, her eyes filled with both relief and worry. She didn't know how the world would react if people discovered that a respected judge had a child he never acknowledged. But for Amara, truth mattered more than reputation. That evening, Harrison couldn't bring himself to go home as usual. Instead, he found himself driving past the small apartment where Amara and her mother lived. He parked across the street and saw them through the window, Amara bouncing around with a toy in her hand while her mother cooked dinner. The scene was simple, but it touched him more than any success in his career ever had. He realized that while he had been sitting in high courtrooms, wearing robes and giving verdicts, real life had been happening without him. The next day, rumors continued to spread around the courthouse. Lawyers and staff whispered in corners, some out of curiosity, others out of judgment. But Harrison walked through the halls differently now. He was quieter, more thoughtful, his mind filled not with laws and cases, but with the innocent eyes of a little girl who had called him her father. Later that week, he arranged a casual meeting at a park, away from the eyes of the public. Amara's mother agreed reluctantly, still unsure how to handle everything. When Amara saw Harrison walking toward them in plain clothes instead of his black robe, she smiled brightly and ran to him without hesitation. She didn't ask for permission, didn't wonder if it was proper, she simply trusted her heart. "Hi, Dad," she said cheerfully, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Harrison froze for a second, then bent down to meet her at eye level. His throat tightened, but he managed to whisper, "Hi, Amara." For the first time, he said her name, and it felt like music in his heart. They spent the afternoon together, walking in the park. Amara held his hand, skipping between him and her mother. She asked him endless questions. Do you like ice cream? Do you have a dog? Can you read stories? Harrison laughed more than he had in years, answering every question with patience and joy. He realized that the girl had already accepted him without hesitation. The only one who needed to catch up was him. As the sun began to set, Amara grew sleepy, resting her head on her mother's shoulder. Harrison watched them and felt something new, something stronger than any pride he had felt in his career. It was love, pure and undeniable. The love of a father who had been given a second chance. But deep inside, he also felt fear. How would the public react? Would people question his integrity as a judge? Would his reputation survive the whispers of scandal? He knew challenges lay ahead. Yet when he looked at Amara, sleeping peacefully, he knew that none of that mattered compared to being a father to her. The little girl's words in the courtroom had shaken the ground beneath his feet, but they had also opened a new path, a path toward redemption, truth, and family. And though the future remained uncertain, one thing was clear: Judge Harrison could no longer deny what his heart already knew. Amara was his daughter. When the court reopened a few days later, everyone was watching carefully to see what Judge Harrison would do. The story of the little girl calling him her father had already spread far beyond the courthouse. Clerks whispered in the hallways, lawyers exchanged knowing glances, and even the cleaning staff talked quietly about the judge's secret. For a man who had lived most of his life with discipline and control, it was unsettling to feel so exposed. Yet, in his heart, he knew the truth could no longer be avoided. As the new judge stepped in to handle the custody case, Harrison sat quietly in the back, not as a judge but as an observer. He had recused himself to keep the proceedings fair. Still, he wanted to see the outcome. When Amara noticed him sitting in the gallery, her face lit up. She waved shyly. Harrison's lips curved into a small smile, but he quickly lowered his eyes, not wanting to draw more attention. The courtroom, once a place where he ruled with authority, now felt different, more personal, more fragile. That evening, after the hearing ended, Harrison made a decision. He could not continue pretending nothing had changed. He called Amara's mother and asked if he could visit them properly. She hesitated, but something in his voice convinced her. Later that night, he stood nervously at the door of their modest apartment, holding a paper bag of groceries he had picked up on the way. When the door opened, Amara rushed forward, wrapping her tiny arms around his legs as if she had known him all her life. "Dad, you came," she said brightly, the word "Dad" slipping off her tongue so naturally it made his chest tighten with emotion. Her mother stood behind her, uncertain, but she let them in. Harrison sat at the small dining table, feeling awkward in the simple home. He was used to polished offices and large rooms, but here everything was different, humble, warm, and filled with little touches of family life. Drawings taped to the refrigerator. A pair of tiny shoes near the door. The faint smell of dinner still in the air. As Amara showed him her favorite toys and proudly displayed her drawings, Harrison listened carefully, smiling more than he had in years. He felt a part of something he had never allowed himself to experience before. For the first time, He wasn't a judge or a man of power. He was just a father, learning about his child. Later, when Amara had gone to bed, Harrison and her mother sat together in the quiet living room. He looked at her seriously. "I want to be in her life," he said. His voice carried both determination and regret. "I've missed too much already." Her mother sighed. "She's happy to have you. But you know this won't be simple. People will talk. The press may twist everything. Your reputation, my reputation doesn't matter compared to her," he interrupted gently. "If I can face criminals and the toughest cases in court, I can face this truth too." For the first time, she saw a side of him she hadn't known before. He wasn't just the strict man driven by his career. He was a father who cared, and perhaps, finally, a man willing to open his heart. Over the following weeks, their lives began to change. Harrison made time to visit Amara often. They went to the park together, where she insisted he push her on the swings. They shared ice cream cones, and he laughed as she always tried to eat the sprinkles first. He listened as she told him about school, about her friends, and about her dreams of becoming an artist one day. Each moment filled him with joy but also reminded him of the years he had lost. One afternoon, Harrison decided to take Amara to his favorite bookstore. Walking through the aisles, she clutched his hand tightly, her eyes wide as she looked at all the shelves filled with stories. He bought her a stack of colorful books, and as they walked out together, she said softly, "You're the best dad." The words nearly broke him. He realized he had spent years searching for meaning in achievements and titles, yet here it was, handed to him by a 6-year-old girl with a simple smile. But not everyone welcomed the change. Some colleagues began to whisper behind his back. At a private gathering of judges, one of them raised the subject with a hint of judgment in his voice. "Quite the surprise, Harrison. Didn't know you had other responsibilities." Harrison met their eyes calmly. "She is my daughter. That's not a responsibility, it's a gift." His words silenced the room. At home, however, he wrestled with doubts. Could he balance his career and his new role as a father? Could he protect Amara from public judgment? He feared the media would turn her life into headlines. But whenever he looked at her face, so full of trust, he knew he had to try. One evening, Amara asked him a question that caught him off guard. They were sitting on the porch outside her apartment, watching the sun go down. "Dad, were you lonely before you met me?" she asked. The question struck deep. He thought about his long years of solitude, filled only with books, law, and empty evenings. He nodded slowly. "Yes," he admitted. "I didn't even know I was lonely until you came." Amara leaned against him and whispered, "I'll keep you company now." Tears welled in his eyes, but he smiled, wrapping an arm gently around her. That night, Harrison promised himself that no matter what the world said, he would never let her down. He had missed her first 6 years, but he would not miss another moment. The once stern judge who had ruled over countless lives with authority was now learning the tender lessons of fatherhood. And though challenges lay ahead, his heart had found a new calling, one that no courtroom could ever provide. The silence that had once fallen in the courtroom when Amara called him dad had turned into something far greater, a silence filled with truth, love, and the beginning of a new chapter. The story of what happened in the courtroom did not disappear. Even though Judge Harrison tried to keep his personal life private, whispers spread through the courthouse and beyond. Some newspapers picked up the story, writing headlines like "Respected Judge Linked to Mystery Daughter." Neighbors spoke quietly, curious about what the truth was. But for Harrison, the noise of the outside world no longer mattered. His focus was on Amara, the little girl who had turned his world upside down with just a few innocent words. At first, the changes in his life felt overwhelming. He had lived for years with a strict routine: early mornings, long hours at court, quiet evenings alone. Now, everything was different. His evenings were filled with visits to Amara's home, reading her bedtime stories, and listening to her endless questions about life. She asked about his childhood, his favorite foods, whether he had ever been scared as a little boy. Every question reminded him of how much she wanted to know him, and how much he wanted to know her. One Saturday morning, Harrison invited Amara and her mother to his house. It was a large, elegant home, quiet and filled with books and awards. But as Amara stepped inside, she wrinkled her nose. "It's too quiet here," she said honestly. "It needs laughing." Harrison chuckled, realizing how empty his home had been until now. By the time she left, the living room was covered in her drawings, the dining table had cookie crumbs everywhere, and the house felt alive for the first time in years. Slowly, the bond between father and daughter grew stronger. At the park, Amara proudly introduced him to her friends. "This is my dad," she said with a big smile. The words melted him every time. At school events, he began showing up, sitting quietly in the back, but his presence made Amara's eyes shine with pride. Teachers noticed the change in her confidence. She was happier, more focused, and full of energy. But not everything was easy. Some people whispered harsh things. A few colleagues questioned his professionalism. "A judge must be above scandal," one said coldly. Harrison listened but stood firm. "There is no scandal in truth," he replied. His reputation, once his greatest treasure, was no longer more important than being a father. There were moments of doubt too. One night, Harrison sat alone in his study, looking at an old photo of Grace. He whispered softly, "I should have found you. I should have known." Regret weighed heavily on him. But then Amara's laughter echoed from the other room, reminding him that while he couldn't change the past, he could choose to be present now. The turning point came a few weeks later when the custody case involving Amara's mother concluded. Another judge ruled fairly, ensuring stability for the family. As the decision was read, Amara clutched her mother's hand with one side and Harrison's with the other. It was a simple gesture, but it spoke louder than any words. She belonged to both of them now. After the hearing, reporters tried to approach, but Harrison shielded Amara gently, whispering, "You don't have to answer to anyone but yourself." She smiled, holding his hand tighter. Over time, the story that had once seemed like a scandal began to be seen differently. People in the community started talking about it not as a shameful secret but as a story of second chances. Some even admired the judge for admitting the truth and stepping into his role as a father. He had shown courage not just in the courtroom, but in his personal life too. One evening, the three of them went out for dinner. Amara sat between her parents, chattering excitedly about school projects and her dreams of becoming an artist. "One day I'll paint the biggest picture in the world," she declared. Harrison smiled warmly. "And I'll be your biggest fan," he promised. As dessert arrived, Amara suddenly grew serious. She looked at Harrison and said, "I'm glad I told the truth in the courtroom that day. Everyone was quiet, but I wasn't scared. I just wanted you to know." His eyes grew misty, and he reached across the table to squeeze her small hand. "You gave me the greatest gift of my life," he whispered. From that moment on, Harrison no longer cared about the whispers or the stares. He walked proudly beside Amara, attending her school plays, cheering for her at sports day, and visiting her favorite ice cream shop every Friday. The community slowly saw the change in him too. He was still a fair judge, but now there was a softness in his eyes, a warmth in his voice that hadn't been there before. Years later, people would still talk about the day the courtroom fell silent. They would remember the little girl who stood bravely and pointed at the judge, calling him her dad. Some would call it a shocking moment, others a turning point. But for Harrison, it was the day his life truly began again. Amara's innocence had cut through walls of pride and fear, reminding everyone that sometimes the purest truths come from the smallest voices. The once lonely judge had found a family. And the little girl who once felt incomplete now had both love and belonging. What started as a whisper of surprise had become a story of love, redemption, and the unbreakable bond between a father and his daughter.